does this lead to? Well, this leads to looking at what are the roles in your organization who are responsible for these business decisions. You have typically the compliance area in one part of the organization, and they're not all just checklist oriented. The really good ones realize that you have to look at the big picture and consider all parts of the organization. But there's way too many organizations who look at compliance as just a checklist type of thing. Well, we've done what it said to do on the audit list, so we're fine. We don't have to worry about it. And another big problem is the letter of the law. This is something, it kind of, I have an 11-year-old, 9-year-old, and they wonder why I enjoy reading laws and regulations. Why do you like reading that? Because I have them try to read them sometimes, so they don't see what the interest is. But have you ever read the HIPAA privacy rule? Have you ever read the HIPAA security rule? Have you read Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act? These laws and regulations are written by people who do not typically come from an IT background. They do not typically come from a privacy or information security background. They have the spirit of the law in their minds, but oftentimes the words they put into the laws are not practical or feasible to actually implement. That creates a problem when you have someone who is a lawyer in your organization who says, the law does not explicitly require that we do this, so we don't need to worry about doing encryption, let's say, although there are at least 2 laws now that require that. But in the past, a lot of lawyers really poo-pooed the idea of implementing encryption for PII throughout an organization. That's an unnecessary cost to the company. It's going to be too big of a hassle to implement. The law says we don't explicitly have to do it, so we're not going to do it. The problem is the spirit of the law. If you start looking at them, almost all of the data protection laws that we have has a requirement that an organization has to implement controls that are appropriate for the risk within the organization. That is a key component of almost every data protection law. You have to implement controls appropriate to risk. What does that mean? Well, that means you do a risk assessment, right? You do a PIA. You have to determine your risk. A big problem throughout many businesses is that they skip that very important part of implementing controls according to risk. So they just go through and try to do the things that are required instead of doing the things that are also offered as being either optional or addressable. So that's why you have a lot of problems out there. HIPAA is a law that I find very fascinating. I wrote a book on it a few years ago. And I really hate how in the security rule they have all these different security requirements. Some are called required, and then some genius who wrote the law decided we're going to call these security activities addressable. Guess what that gets interpreted as meaning in most organizations? Addressable does not mean optional. The lawyers in most healthcare organizations read addressable and said, we don't have to do it. One of the addressable things in there is to use encryption if you have data that's going to be outside of your organization. Well, guess what? When a lot of the information security folks said, this is a big risk to allow this patient data to be sent out in emails, in many organizations, a lot of the lawyers said, no, it's optional. It's addressable. We don't have to do it. And a little time after that, what happens? Data breaches because of clear text info being sent out accidentally to someone whose email address was put into the line. So you need to think that compliance is more complex. It's not just a checklist. Privacy is not just about PII. It's not just about a specific list of items that is listed as being personal items. First of all, there is no one master list of what PII is throughout the entire world. Different laws define PII in different ways. And I know through my research, I've identified 50 specific items that are considered as PII in around 100 laws throughout the world. But what's very interesting is in most of those laws, there's the good old catch-all item at the bottom of the list that says anything that can be linked to an individual. So that kind of opens up something that most companies say, ooh, we don't want to know about that because that's going to make it too hard to establish the controls for this. But also remember that PII alone is not the only thing that has to do with privacy. You can find out a lot about people without even knowing a person's specific name or knowing what their address is. You can narrow things down from information that doesn't seem to be that important to give you an idea of an individual. For example, if you would look at certain types of internet activity that's going on in Madison County, Iowa, and the different types of purchases that might be being made online, I can tell you Madison County, Iowa is a pretty, it's not a densely populated area. I live there. We have a lot of farms there. It wouldn't be too hard if somebody wanted to analyze the activity going on from a specific location in the county to figure out that it might be me or someone in my household doing that activity. So you have to keep in mind, too, when you're establishing privacy controls within organizations, it's not just about PII either. It's how you're using and making decisions for all types of information that could point to an individual. And security is more than bits and bytes. There's so many different breaches that have occurred as a result of non-digital data. Disposal is huge. I mean, just last week, the second ever sanction came down from the Department of Health and Human Services against CVS for not being in compliance with the privacy rule, because what were they doing? They were taking and throwing away printed prescriptions, and also even the bottles with still the prescription label on it, into their dumpsters out behind their buildings throughout many of their stores. HIPAA has been around for so long, but yet this is only the second sanction that they've had for noncompliance, but $2.25 million. Now that should get their attention, don't you think? That might be a good reason to go ahead and have other covered entities to start establishing controls over data that's not purely digital. So remember that information is in many, many forms. Also, I've seen way too many companies, and I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's so important because I don't think it gets talked about enough, how if you want to have successful security and privacy within your organization, you must communicate with the other business leaders throughout the organization. You cannot and should not expect that you are the person who knows the value of business unit data more than the business unit leaders. You are the ones that are going to have to give the best advice about how to protect valuable data, but they have to tell you how valuable that data is and where that data is located.